In the early 1990s, The Simpsons was a cultural phenomenon, redefining television with its sharp humor, quirky characters, and satirical take on American life. Naturally, it wasn't long before the world of gaming tapped into the chaotic charm of Springfield, bringing Homer, Bart, and the rest of the family into the interactive spotlight. In 1991, The Simpsons Arcade Game burst into arcades, offering players a chance to brawl their way through a colorful and chaotic Springfield. Developed by Konami, the game captured the irreverent humor and iconic art style of the show, delivering a cooperative beat 'em up experience that quickly became a fan favorite. It wasn't just a game, it was the beginning of The Simpsons' journey into video game history, paving the way for countless adaptations across genres. Today, we're diving into the early days of The Simpsons in gaming, exploring how this arcade classic set the stage for many different Springfield adventures and pixels. So grab a controller, choose your favorite Simpson, and join us for today's nostalgic trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 237th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we're heading to Springfield to dive into the early days of The Simpsons in video games, starting with the iconic Simpsons Arcade Game. Released in 1991, this colorful beat 'em up captured the humor and chaos of the beloved TV series while cementing its place as a nostalgic arcade classic. After starting there, we'll look at the rest of the Simpsons video games from the 90s, and we'll learn a little bit about Matt Groening's career too. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who'd probably spend all his arcade tokens just to save Maggie from Mr. Burns. I know that to be a fact, actually. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, do you think you're better at rescuing Maggie, or would you be like Homer and just eat all the donuts along the way?
Well, you can't save Maggie without eating the donuts along the way, so realistically, it'd have to be both.
Well, we did do both.
Exactly.
We did do both because we took some time out in the past year and we played through this together. We're actually familiar
more
with
longer
it.
than a year.
Has it really? I'm pretty sure we did it last year. Didn't we do it early last year?
I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows?
I don't know. But hey, we are both familiar with a topic.
Mm-hmm. That's a first in a while.
That doesn't always happen.
Nope, first in a while.
Well, like I said, we're going to learn about Matt Groening, and inevitably I went down the rabbit hole, and we're going to learn about all the Simpsons video games from the 90s. I thought that was a good place to cut it. But before we do all that, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
First up, on March 14th, 1983, Game & Watch Mario Bros. Was released, introducing Luigi for the first time, predating the arcade version by nearly 2 weeks. Unlike its arcade counterpart, this Game & Watch title focused on Mario and Luigi working in a bottling plant, moving packages up conveyor belts in a unique, horizontally opening clamshell design. Players controlled each brother separately, using simple up and down movements to keep the workflow going and avoid dropping pallets. Mario Bros. Showcased Nintendo's knack for engaging, accessible gameplay and remains a notable entry in the Game & Watch multi-screen series.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. On March 11th, 1995, Chrono Trigger was released for the Super Famicom in Japan, quickly earning recognition as one of the greatest RPGs of all time. Developed by Square and featuring a dream team of creators, including Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, and Akira Toriyama, the game introduced innovative mechanics such as multiple endings, the active Time Battle 2.0 system, and seamless time-traveling gameplay. Its engaging story, memorable characters, and breathtaking soundtrack by Yasunori Mitsuda and Nobuo Omatsu solidified Chrono Trigger as a masterpiece. Decades later, it remains a landmark title that continues to influence RPG design.
We learned about it, I believe, episode 50. It was our golden episode.
Yeah, I definitely remember talking about it, but I couldn't tell you what number. So
Yeah,
if that sounds right, that sounds right. There you go. Yeah.
yeah. Excellent game.
Indeed. Next up, on March 9th, 1996, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars debuted in Japan, bringing a unique fusion of role playing elements and the beloved Mario universe to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Developed through a collaboration between Nintendo and Square, the game introduced players to a whimsical story where Mario teamed up with unlikely allies, including Mallow and Geno, to thwart the evil Smithy and recover the Seven Stars. Super Mario RPG featured turn based combat with timed button presses for added engagement, a vibrant isometric world, and charming humor that appealed to fans of both franchises. The game is widely celebrated as a classic, remembered for its innovative gameplay and its role in paving the way for future RPGs in the Mario series, including the Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi franchises.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like, didn't we talk about that one there, Dave?
We've talked about Super Mario
Yeah.
RPG, but we've never done it as a topic yet.
Maybe we were thinking about doing it coming up. Maybe like next year or something. Maybe that's what
It's
it.
an excellent game.
Hmm. Oh, we were talking because it was the remake. That's right. Next up, on March 13th, 2003, Final Fantasy X2 was released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan, marking the first direct sequel in Final Fantasy history. Developed by Square Enix, the game followed Yuna, Riku, and newcomer Pain on a quest to uncover the secrets of Spira 2 years after the events of Final Fantasy X. Departing from the series' traditional somber tone, X2 introduced a more upbeat, mission based structure and a dynamic dress sphere system that allowed for mid battle job changes. While its lighthearted style divided fans, the game was praised for its fast paced combat and deep customization, securing its place as a unique entry in the Final Fantasy series. And last up, we have on March 10th, 2015, Cities Skylines was released, offering a fresh take on the city building genre and quickly becoming the go to alternative to SimCity. Developed by Colossal Order and published by Paradox Interactive, the game provided deep simulation mechanics, expansive city customization, and modding support that allowed players to shape their urban landscapes with unprecedented freedom. Its intuitive design, complex traffic system, and lack of restrictive online requirements helped it earn widespread acclaim. City Skylines not only revitalized the genre, but also grew into a long running success supported by numerous expansions and a passionate community of city building enthusiasts, such
Silly,
as myself.
silly building enthusiasts instead of
Yes,
city.
we do silly buildings because
Yes.
you get bored of the same old stuff and you're like, hey, what can I do that's crazy? And then you do it.
People have made some amazing cities with skylines and its mods.
Oh, absolutely. One of my favorite things is to there's a civil engineer who plays it, and like he'll work on people's designs and fix them and make traffic flow, and it's just it's
That's
cool. It's
cool.
fun. Yeah. But I don't think people are here to listen to that, Dave. I think they're here to hear about the Simpsons games. So,
Matt Groening grew up in Portland, Oregon. His mother, Margaret Ruth, was once a teacher. His father, Homer Phillip, a filmmaker, advertiser, writer, and cartoonist. After graduating high school, Groening attended the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, a liberal arts school, where he served as editor of the campus newspaper. And for the newspaper, he also wrote articles and he drew cartoons. So, following in his dad's footsteps. In 1977, at the ripe old age of 23, he moved to Los Angeles to become a writer. He did not find success, but instead went through what he called a series of lousy jobs, including being a television extra, bussing tables, washing dishes at a nursing home, clerking at the Hollywood Licorice Pizza record store, landscaping in a sewage treatment plant,
Oh.
and ghostwriting for a retired Western director. In order to cope with this, his dreams were not panning out the way he had hoped. He started writing a comic book called Life in Hell, which he used to describe life in Los Angeles to his friends. After drawing the comic and penciling it by hand, he would photocopy it and then distribute it to all his friends and sell it for $2 a copy at the Licorice Pizza record store. An editor for Wet magazine happened into the store one day. He bought one of Groening's Life is Hell comics and he liked it. So he offered Groening some work, and in 1978, Life in Hell debuted as a comic strip in the avant-garde magazine Wet. And as a comic strip in Wet, it grew a cult following, and as a cult strip through word of mouth, it became more and more popular. So eventually, through this popularity, it was picked up by other publications. In 1980, it was also picked up by the Los Angeles Reader, and then it just snowballed from there. In November of 1984, his then girlfriend, later his wife, offered to publish a series of relationship themed Life in Hell strips and compile them and put them together as a book. And that book was titled Life in Hell. And through its first two printings, Life in Hell sold 22,000 copies.
Not too shabby.
At the end of the comic strip's run, Life in Hell's run, it was carried by over 250 newspapers across the nation. And it ended in 2012, so our story is going to keep going in the 80s, but that Life in Hell comic strip, Matt Groening carried that on for a long, long time.
That's impressive with everything else.
Right? Prior to Life in Hell's run through 2012, though, way back in 1985, there was a television producer named James L. Brooks who had been shown one of the Life is Hell strips, and he absolutely loved it. So he reached out to Matt Groening with the proposition of working in animation on an undefined future project. Matt Groening agreed, and it was revealed to him that he would be developing a series of short animated skits, they called them bumpers, for what was going to be a variety show on Fox called The Tracy Ullman Show. Now, Brooks wanted Groening to adapt his Life in Hell characters for the show, but Groening was afraid that he was going to have to give up ownership of his characters, and that the show was going to fail, and it would take his comic book strip, which obviously he was still doing and would be doing for a long time, down with it. And so, as he sat in the lobby for James L. Brooks, waiting to meet with Brooks and other producers, he quickly sketched out his version of a dysfunctional family, which he called The Simpsons. He famously named the characters after his own family. His mother, Margaret, became Marge. His father, Homer, remained Homer. His younger sisters, Lisa and Margaret, became Lisa and Maggie. And as for Bart Simpson, he thought it would be too obvious if he named a character after himself, so he chose Bart because it was an anagram of brat.
Wow. Didn't know that, and that's hilarious.
When the Simpsons shorts first appeared in the Tracy Ullman Show, they were crudely drawn because Groening had just submitted basic sketches to the animators, expecting them to touch them up, clean them up, pencil them, and so on and so forth. But instead, they just traced over his initial drawings. For 3 seasons of the Tracy Ullman Show, The Simpsons appeared. The first season pretty irregularly, but in every episode during seasons 2 and 3. From April 19th, 1987 until May 14th, 1989, 48 different shorts appeared on the Tracy Ullman show. Shorts that just became more and more popular as time went on. The Tracy Ullman show, however, not so much.
True that.
You're a Simpsons fan, right?
Yep.
Have you ever watched the shorts at this point?
I cannot say I've seen them, no.
Okay. Yeah, well, they never released the shorts on DVD. Some of the shorts have been seen later on. Like, I think there's a Treehouse of Horrors episode that uses the shorts as a flashback or something along those lines. So a bunch of the shorts have been drawn. I wouldn't say a bunch. I think 4 or 5 of the shorts have been drawn into the normal Simpsons show. But by and large, they've never done anything with these shorts. You can, needless to say, which I did, go online to YouTube and look at the shorts. It's like 2.5 hours to get through all 47 of them, and I left them on while I was doing my research for this episode.
Hmm.
So
Nice.
a decision was made at one point, because the Simpsons were popular and Tracy Ullman was not, to spin the Simpsons off into their own TV show in 1989. And so a team of production companies were hired to adapt The Simpsons into a half-hour series, specifically for the Fox Broadcasting Company. And that show that we still know as The Simpsons premiered on December 17th, 1989. It was an instant hit. It averaged 27 million viewers throughout its first season. Uh, it held no, not 27. I think 17. It held viewership of over 20 million. No, I did it right. It averaged 27. God damn. It was an instant hit. It averaged 27 viewers.
Wow.
It was an instant hit. It averaged 27 million viewers throughout its first season. It held viewership over 20 million people for each of its first 4 seasons.
Damn. That's impressive.
As you may or may not know, 36 years later, it is still on the air. It is now the longest running American animated series. It's the longest running American sitcom. And it's the longest running American scripted primetime television series, both in seasons and individual episodes. Are they literally on season 36 now?
I'm
I
not
think
exactly
so.
sure which. I know it's up there, but I can't know if it's exactly that.
The popularity of The Simpsons has made it a billion-dollar merchandising industry. The family and its cast of supporting characters appear on everything from t-shirts to board games to posters. Heck, even the show's 20th anniversary was commemorated with a stamp by the U.S. Postal Service. The Simpsons have been absolutely everywhere. So, no doubt that when this merchandising barrage began, in fact, we know it to have been even talked about even before the first episode of The Simpsons aired, that there were plans to set video games in the Simpsons universe. And the first one and second one, because there's some debate over which actually came first, came less than a few years into the airing of The Simpsons, and it's also the reason why we are discussing The Simpsons today. So I thought that in celebration of an anniversary, that we could look at the games from the Simpsons franchise that were made during the height of its popularity. That's where we started. I started out with the 8-bit and 16-bit, and there were really only a few games outside of that era that were released in the 90s, and so it ended up just being, by the time I finished my research and writing, it ended up being a whole, here's all the Simpsons games from the 90 episodes. So that's what we're doing today. We're looking at all the Simpsons games from the 90s.
Okay. Sounds like a plan.
Sounds like a plan. Yes, indeed. One of the first video games to release, not necessarily the first, but the reason why we are here today is where we started. It is the Simpsons Arcade Cabinet, which found its way into arcades in March of 1991. The Simpsons Arcade is a side scrolling beat 'em up that allows four players to control members of the Simpsons family as they fight various enemies to rescue Maggie. It was incredibly popular. It ended up being one of the top three best selling arcade cabinets for the entirety of 1991. Rob, what did you think of the Simpsons Arcade Cabinet when you and I played through it?
Well, I don't know anything about the cabinet.
Yeah,
I'm
I
sure it was made of
realized.
good quality, and I'm sure that it was fun putting those quarters in. But as for the console port of that game, I did find it to be quite enjoyable. It was it was expected for an arcade game, not crazy long, but definitely designed to keep you wanting to put quarters in to keep playing. Um,
I think
and
it took us an hour to play through it,
yeah,
if
but it
that.
was fun that whole time.
I remember when that cabinet first came out. It was a as the sales go, it was a big hit. Obviously, one of the top three arcade cabinets of 1991. And it was coming on the tails of the Turtles arcade cabinet that we both love, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, that was the popular style of gameplay at the time, and it really worked well to turn The Simpsons, which was the biggest hit, like one of the biggest television shows at the time, into that style of arcade cabinet because it was a lot of fun, and because four people could play at once. There was always a crowd around it, and everyone was doing a good job, having a great time. You had the Simpsons characters in the we talk about the attract mode, right, where the cabinet has screens and it says things to get people to want to play it. So it had an attract mode that actually had the voices from the Simpsons, which was something that was really cool. And I do remember just dumping quarters into it to play. I wasn't very good at it. I don't know if I ever got past. I probably got past the first level. I don't think I ever got past the second level. I mean, I was a kid at the time, right? It came out
Yeah,
when I
whatever
was
excuse you need.
it came out when I was 7.
Keep telling yourself that. That's just making excuses.
But it was a lot of fun, and I just remember, like, to me that period was that was the arcade heyday for me, when people were crowding around cabinets like that and having a good time, um and playing a lot of fun group games like that. So it was a good time. uh, the popularity of the cabinet led it to be ported. It was ported over to the Commodore 64, which is really weird to think of in 1991.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Isn't that just bizarre to think about? We talk about so many games in the 80s with the Commodore. Thinking about a 1991 game, NES era. I mean, I guess the Commodore and NES existed a lot because there are a lot of ports between them, but it's still just weird to think of sometimes. Anyway, they ported that game over to the Commodore 64. They also ported it over to MS-DOS computers. And then, as we found out years later, around 2012, it was brought over to the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. I also think there's an iOS version even later than that that's like a single player game. Same game, just single player. So, that 2012 port, we never really tackled this, but that port allows you to unlock the Japanese version of the game, which had some notable differences. They added like small scale nuclear bombs that would clear all the enemies on the screen. It had a life bar. The life bar in the American was just a single life bar, but in the Japanese version, it could go up and double on itself 3 times.
Damn.
And then there were hidden items that, like some of those other games that time, if you hit the wall would crumble and reveal a hidden item underneath it. So there were some of those in Japanese version. And then the scoring system was slightly different. In the North American version, you get a point a kill, but they slightly changed scoring for the Japanese version. So there does exist a different version of the game out there. Why they needed to make those changes for the Japanese market, I do not know, but they did. I will say, aside from that iOS version, though, you could actually still go get this arcade cabinet. I've seen it at Walmart more recently than not, because that company, Arcade Up or Arcade One Up or whatever it is, that makes replica arcade cabinets, like they're not full size cabinets,
Hmm.
they make one that is the Simpsons arcade cabinet, and I have seen it for sale for like, I don't know, $400 or $500. So you can actually go out and buy a replica cabinet and play this game for yourself, which is kind of cool.
Interesting.
What is likely the first Simpsons game ever released is called The Simpsons Bart versus the Space Mutants. It is a 2D side scrolling platformer in which the player controls Bart Simpson through 5 levels as he tries to ruin the aliens' planet to take over the world. Uh, this one supposedly came out in the end of February of 1991, and the arcade cabinet was first unveiled in March. So this is likely the first Simpsons game, although it kind of gets muddy depending on where you look at your resource or where you look it up. Um, Bart versus Space Mutant came out for the NES. It came out for the Amiga, the Amstrad, the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, and the ZX Spectrum. And then a year later, they also brought it over to the Sega platforms like the Genesis, the Master System, and the Game Gear. So Bart versus Space Mutants kind of got everywhere. And between all those platforms, it sold over 1 million copies, which is really crazy for an 8-bit game in the early 90s. Now, according to its director, Gary Kitchen, and we've discussed Gary Kitchen before on the podcast, we've looked at a few of his games, and we did an episode on game making software, and there is a Gary Kitchen's game maker. That game, The Simpsons Bart versus Space Mutants, was offered to him by Acclaim literally a few days before the first episode even aired. And basically, Gary's boss at Acclaim had basically said, "Hey, we want you to look into The Simpsons as a licensed property that we'll develop games around." And obviously, they made that happen. And we got Bart versus the Space Mutants, which I remember Bart versus the Space Mutants. It was incredibly hard, like incredibly hard.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I remember about the early Simpsons games. And again, I was young. You know what I mean? But I just remember them all being incredibly hard, which was frustrating. But then again, I guess that's true for a lot of games in that time period because I have repeatedly said and complained about hard, games from that time period, and then we've gone back and played them like now, and I've been like, oh, that wasn't so bad. So, there's definitely a difficulty deal. Also, I now have 30 years of experience, so that changes things. Anyway,
Excuses.
I know 1991 actually saw two more releases in the Simpsons universe. They made four whole games with the Simpsons set in the Simpsons universe when the Simpsons Mania was in full drive, which is just four Simpsons games in a year is crazy to think about. In April, they released a Game Boy game. It was called Bart Simpson's Escape from Camp Deadly. And in it, the player controls Bart as he escapes from an unpleasant summer camp run by ruthless counselors. There's a later fun little fact. There's a later Simpsons episode called Camp Krusty that has a nearly identical plot, but the game was released a year before the episode even aired. So who knows if there's any correlation there.
Hmm. That is quite interesting.
And then in December of 1991, they released Simpsons Bart versus the World, which is instead of the Space Mutants, now he's against the world, and he basically goes around the world, Bart, on a scavenger hunt, as Mr. Burns and all his cohorts are trying to thwart. Now, all of these early Simpsons games on the Nintendo, I should say, they really all got mixed reviews from critics, but they sold well. I mean, 27 on average 27 million people were watching each episode of the TV series. With that many eyes on it, there are bound to be a large number of video gamers that would be interested in playing video games set in their favorite TV show.
Absolutely.
So, um, even when the critics lambasted a game, and they lambasted all of them, admittedly, all of them, the game still sold well. I mean, they had all the clout. They had all the Simpsons clout behind them.
It is a powerful thing to have, Dave.
Indeed. So, in just a few short years, The Simpsons had already made a massive impact on gaming, with 4 different titles released in 1991 alone. From arcades to home consoles, players everywhere were getting a chance to step into Springfield and cause some chaos with Bart, Homer, and the rest of the family.
Yeah, The Simpsons were practically everywhere. But you know what else deserves to be everywhere?
What's that, Rob?
Your voice.
Mmm.
If you've ever wanted to start your own podcast but weren't sure where to begin, our friends at Zencaster make it easier than ever to share your passion with the world.
That's absolutely right, Rob. With Zencaster's all in one platform, you can record high quality audio and video straight from your web browser. No complicated setups, no expensive equipment. Just click record and you're good to go.
And their built in post production tools take your podcast to the next level. Zencaster automatically removes background noise, balances your audio, and even takes care of those awkward pauses and filler words.
And when you're ready to share your episode, Zencaster makes it simple to distribute your podcast to all the major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
So, if you've ever been thinking about launching a podcast, now's the time. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our code MemoryCardLane, all one word, to get 30% off your first month of any paid plan.
Rob, I think that's a deal that even Mr. Burns would approve of.
Excellent.
So don't wait. Start your podcasting journey with Zencaster today.
All right, Dave. What other games were set in the Simpsons universe?
Well, the NES, Rob, actually saw 2 more games developed for it. In December of 1992, Acclaim released another platform game for the NES. It was called The Simpsons Bartman Meets Radioactive Man. Do you remember Bartman?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
His alter ego. And fun thing about that one is Bartman really wasn't featured terribly much in the series, at least back when. And there's a lot of people that even now are like, why did they decide to do a Bartman, feature Bartman at the time? I mean, because it made for a good video game, I guess.
Mm hmm.
That game features Bart as Bartman. He's obviously on a comic book quest to rescue his kidnapped idol, which of course is, Radioactive Man. That one dragged through the mud by all the critics. A few months earlier, in May of 1992, they developed a puzzle game called Krusty's Funhouse.
Ooh, that sounds fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know about you, but a crusty fun house is kind of a mixed message for me. So,
Yeah, quite. Not like a place I would probably want to be hanging out.
but this is not a crusty fun house. It's Krusty the Clown's fun house, Rob.
Oh, that's much different. That might be okay. I mean, it's still questionable. Let's be real.
And basically, this puzzle game, as a player, you're basically directing rats to an extermination area through a complicated, like all these maze-like levels. You have a certain number of rats that you have to direct through it to get to the end, and when you hit the magical number, you move on to the next puzzle. Reality is that Krusty's Funhouse is just a reskin of another game called Rat Trap that was created by the same developer. They just kind of took that game, added Simpsons elements, and called it a day. In fact, the background of the 2 games is identical. When I say Simpsons
Oh,
elements, not even the backgrounds were changed.
wow, that's bad.
Hey, whatever makes a game, right?
I guess if it works, it works.
If it works, it works. Now, Krusty's Funhouse was originally developed for the Super Nintendo. They ported Krusty's Funhouse over to the NES, and it didn't do any better as an NES port. But, it originally started on the SNES, and there were some other games I think we should look at that were also released. I gotta pause this. Give me just a second. So, Krusty's Funhouse was originally developed for the Super NES, but it was also ported over to the NES. Not that that did any better. Didn't didn't matter where it came from or what it was. It still kind of got lambasted no matter where you look. But speaking of the Super NES, aside from Krusty's Funhouse, there were three more titles released on the 16-bit platform. One of them was released in October of 1992. It was called Bart's Nightmare, and it had players guiding Bart through one of his dreams in which he had lost his homework, and has to go and find all of the lost pages of his homework, And then whenever he finds a homework page, he jumps into it and he plays one of a number of mini games. One of my favorites, you play as Bartzilla, who has to like stomp through the streets of Springfield and basically destroy an army with fire breath and lasers that shoot out of your eyes. And then if you get past the army, you have to climb the Springfield State Building and you get to fight Homer Kong and Momthra.
Nice. That's
So
good.
they did a lot of really good visual gags in The Simpsons that worked really well in video games too.
Oh, absolutely, they did.
Now, Bart's Nightmare was made by a company called Sculptured Software, and they used a similar game design for their next Super Nintendo title, which was released in September of 1994, and that's called Virtual Bart. Same kind of concept, a bunch of mini games. This one had 6 different mini games, but instead of having an overworld where you chase the games down like in the homework pages, this one just had a roulette wheel that picked whichever game you were going to play.
Wow, nice.
My guess is they made too many mini games for the first one, and then they turned them into another video game with no pretense whatsoever. That's my best guess.
I mean, it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah, they're just reusing. One of the good mini games in Virtual Bart is called Class Picture. Basically, Bart wants to ruin his school's picture day by throwing tomatoes at all of his classmates. Um, Tomatoes are eggs. It's one of the two, and basically, like they're like ducks, and he has to throw all these projectiles at them. And if he succeeds, at the end, he's the only yearbook photo that doesn't have egg or tomato on it. So
Hmm.
that was a fun one. And then they kind of broadened their horizons, Rob. In March of 1995, Acclaim, who had been publishing these Sculptured Software titles, they released a side-scrolling platformer that was based on the Itchy and Scratchy show,
Ooh,
which,
very
if you guys
nice.
don't know, is a show within a show, right?
Mhm.
It's a television show that the Simpsons family watches. In the Itchy and Scratchy game, you basically play as Itchy, and you have to go around and torture and kill Scratchy. And if you know anything about Itchy and Scratchy, it's traditionally very gory, unusually gory, and that all that classic gory violence from the television show is found in this video game too, which is surprising for a 1995 video game. But here we are. I guess Mortal. That's a few years after Mortal Kombat, so all that stuff was finished and done, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it was a little more normalized by that point.
Yeah, sure was. Um, I need a transition here, Rob. Remember when we talked about Krusty's Funhouse?
I sure do.
Well, they ported it over to Game Boy as well.
That's an interesting one.
And then they made 3 more games for the Game Boy.
Oh, wow.
Krusty's Funhouse is a good transition between all of them. I mean, it's just a game where you make rats go everywhere, but somehow I've turned it into 3 transitions now, so
I mean, clearly it worked.
it did work. It's fantastic. Krusty's Funhouse is the best game out of this bunch. Not In September of 1992, Bart versus the Juggernauts was an action game. It's inspired by American Gladiators. We did a whole episode on American Gladiators.
We sure did.
Remember that thing started in like the gymnasium of a high school that they borrowed?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's where they filmed the first one, and then they somehow turned that into a syndicated television show.
It's crazy, but
They did it.
sometimes they just made it work.
They made it work, and we talked about it. We did a whole episode on it. check it out if you want to learn more. So in Bart versus the Juggernauts, takes he participates in a television show called Juggernauts USA, and basically in Juggernauts there's like 7 different challenges to win, and all of these challenges are based on different characters from The Simpsons. For example, the obstacle course takes place in Apu's Quickie Mart store, so a whole bunch of fun little mini games to play. In February of 1994, Bart and the Beanstalk was published by Acclaim. Obviously, it's a parody of Jack and the Beanstalk. Bart comes. I
Oh,
know it was hard to know, wasn't it?
a little bit, yeah.
Bart comes home with magic beans. Homer gets angry, and then the beans grow, and craziness ensues. Didn't they do an actual Simpsons episode to that effect?
Um,
No,
I mean, maybe there's so many, man. It's hard to remember.
I know.
I'm not the biggest Simpsons expert. We would have to ask our sister for that.
Also on the Game Boy, they made Itchy and Scratchy and Miniature Golf Madness that came out in November of 1994. You basically control Scratchy as he plays mini golf while trying to avoid Itchy's attacks. And while many of the games we've discussed today were ported over to computer platforms, there was only one in this first early time period that was released solely for computers in this first 4 years, and therefore it's not really well known. And that game is called Bart's House of Weirdness, and it's an action adventure game that has Bart grounded to his room by Homer and Marge after pulling one too many pranks. He gets bored and he sneaks out and escapes into Springfield. I watched a playthrough of this one because I'd never heard of it before. It has 6 levels and a final battle. He basically helps his sister recover a ball, explores the basement and attic of the Simpsons home, sneaks out to the movie theater, sneaks out to the mall, and he has a dream in which he's inserted into the Itchy and Scratchy universe. And then at the end, he finds his way to the circus where he has to save Krusty the Clown from Sideshow Bob. So, and throughout these levels, he fights dust bunnies, spiders, ghosts, space mutants, and Itchy and Scratchy in that dream world. And for all purposes, reviews on this one were really positive. Most everyone was super confused as to why it was never ported to anything else. No clue. World may never know. Um, and so, yeah, you have this really weird one that you can go find online called Bart's House of Weirdness. And it plays and sounds like a Simpsons game, which is kind of cool. Now, those are all the games that were made in the first 4 years, roughly 4 or 5 years, 1994, 1994. What I would consider the height of the Simpsons fad. Not that it ever, not that it wasn't popular after that, but after about the 4th season, it started to fall beneath 20 million viewers, and nowadays I think it averages only 500,000 viewers. So per episode. But there were only a couple games made for The Simpsons outside of that time period in the 90s, literally 2, and they both happened to be for computers. So I thought we could talk about them too, Rob.
Okay.
In 1996, Fox Interactive made a filmmaking computer program called The Simpsons Cartoon Studio, which lets you create your own Simpsons cartoon using characters, sounds, music, and locations from the show. It has 17 characters, 50 special effects, 270 props, and 35 backgrounds. Uh, Thousands of individual cells that were hand drawn by the actual Simpsons cartoonists that you could maneuver and put together to make your own story. Now, not fully active like Simpsons episode. We had a bunch of games back then. It would let you do some really basic set of actions. Homer could crawl, he could ride on a tube, he could run away screaming. Bart could run or trip over something. He could ride his bike away, skateboard away, and I think he could paint graffiti with spray paint. So um, it was mostly just copy and paste, and you could tell your own story with the elements they got. But it's kind of cool to be able to maneuver elements that were actually cell shaded by the actual Simpsons cartoonist. I think that would have been a neat thing for fans.
Oh, absolutely. That would have been neat.
And then lastly, in 1997, Fox Interactive also made a game pretty much for fans too called The Simpsons Virtual Springfield. And basically, it allowed you to explore a virtual representation of Springfield. You would just meet the characters, and like the whole goal was to collect all these character cards. So it has a bunch of mini games, but it kind of well known for not having a plot other than collect the cards. But it does give us a very interesting story that I thought we could talk about today to wrap up our episode. That is a fun little deal attached to Virtual Springfield, right?
What's that, Dave?
When the designers were working on visualizing the game, they actually constructed a real life replica of the Simpsons house and then they gave it away in a contest.
Oh?
So as the story goes, they were looking to advertise. There was an architectural company that had kind of done something in Paris where they had put a house on a building, and it had gone well. So they reached out to them and said, "Hey, can you help us with this? We'd like to actually build, a Simpsons house." And then we wanted, they also used it to make Virtual Springfield, so double purpose. And so they made a sweepstakes, and the sweepstakes was advertised via Pepsi products. Certain products would have these numbered game pieces, and if it matched the number that was broadcasted on the screen during the fall premiere of the show in 97 or 98, you would win the house. So the episode comes and goes, and no one steps forward to claim the prize. So obviously, someone just threw that game piece out, probably. You know how many people do those things and don't even bother to claim those.
That would be so devastating.
And so there was a plan B. The plan B, according to the rules, was they had a raffle. People could mail in forms to win this prize or other prizes, and so they raffled off all these names and got a winner. That winner was a 63-year-old retired factory worker who lived in rural Kentucky. The story I read said that she was in such a rural area that Fox's limousines couldn't even get down the road to her home. So the network goes and, oh, you won. There's this whole thing. They fly her two daughters, and a grandson out to this new house, which is in Nevada. In fact, that was this lady's first time ever on a plane, right?
Oh, wow.
So she gets some money to spend. Like, she gets to go to some casinos and have some fun. And then they take her to the house. They tour her around. There's a ceremony where they give her a big ceremonial key. And it didn't just look like the Simpsons house on the outside. Like, it looked like the Simpsons house on the inside. Like, it had legitimate furniture, but it was made to look cartoony. Like you were actually in an episode of The Simpsons. It was legitimately the Simpsons house inside and out.
That's crazy.
In the end, sweepstake winners had two choices. They could take the house or they could take a cash prize. And for whatever reason, she took the cash prize.
Oh, man. Missing out.
I guess the way the story goes is that she lived in the middle of nowhere. They had an ostrich and tobacco farm and had no desire to relocate whatsoever.
Oh, okay.
And there wasn't really anything else they could do with the house. It was built in a normal neighborhood with a homeowners association, so it couldn't be opened as like a museum or for tourists. That was out of the question. The colors that it was painted actually violated the homeowners association agreement of the neighborhood it was built in. So like it had to be repainted like immediately after all this stuff went down. And like I said, it looked like the Simpsons house inside and out. So they had to post security guards as everyone was figuring out what to do with this because people would like sneak in and actually steal items because they had like a replica of the dog food bowl, for instance, and pictures on the wall that of the Simpsons, and people would sneak in and literally like pry that kind of stuff off the wall. So
wow.
It eventually sold. The lady who bought it said it was a big house for a good price.
Nice. Hey, can't beat that.
And she renovated it. Like all this crap that people destroyed, they kind of put back together. She kept it. I mean, the pictures I saw were, it still looks a lot like the Simpsons house. So, I mean, they kept it somewhat that way. I'm sure now, many years later, they probably redid it. But they bought the house, and then it just became the Simpsons house, and they had to put up with crazy fans who would visit from time to time. She told stories like, there were drunken, her sons would talk to drunken college students that would show up in the middle of the night, banging at the door to be let into the Simpsons house. But
Jeez.
it's not really the Simpsons heyday anymore, so not as popular. So that's kind of, winded down, and now they just kind of live in the security of Ring cameras, the story goes. So,
Hmm. Still pretty
um,
neat.
which is kind of fascinating for sure. And honestly, that's about it. That'll do it for Simpsons games in the 90s. They made 15 games in that first decade of The Simpsons, 12 of them in that first 4 years alone. So at the height of the Simpsons fad, they made a dozen games set in the Simpsons universe, and then they made three more outside of that first. In the 6 years that followed, basically they made three more games. In case you're curious, now to this day there are 27 games set in the Simpsons universe. So they, in the next 20 some years that have followed, they only made another, what's that, 13 games, roughly 12 games.
Math.
Math. So almost doubled it, but we'll save a lot of those for another day because there's some fun ones in there that we like Road Rage, for instance.
Got that right.
Yeah, I know that's your favorite.
Well, now hit and run.
Okay, fair enough, close enough. So lots of other things going on, lots of other games. We talked about in the beginning, like Super Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger. Those are some fantastic episodes. If you'd like to check them out, we have old episodes that you can find on our website, which is www.memorycarlane.com. Rob, what else can people do on our website?
You can find a calendar of our future episode topics. There can be found a link to our Discord server where you can come talk with Dave and I about episode topics or maybe some other stuff. There is a link to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is wrong. Each week, ladies and gent, we will tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a console, a technology, people. I've done it on a museum before. We just find one topic that is relevant to the current week and we roll with it. While doing so, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, of course, we talked about the early career of Matt Groening as he created The Simpsons, and then we talked about the first decade of Simpsons video games. One of the best parts about getting to do this each week is when I sit down to research new episodes, I learn new things. That's what excites me. I learn something new, and then I get to teach you guys something new. And I just love that cycle of teaching and learning. And so, in recognition and celebration of said cycle, each week we talk about our own takeaways. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think that my favorite takeaway from today would probably be that for whatever reason, the Japanese edition of the arcade cabinet that we played had a bunch of changes and additions, whatever you want to call them. Um, it's just interesting. I feel like a lot of the times the ports don't have, or the different editions don't have a whole lot of changes. I guess I don't know a ton because I'm not too familiar with how things are over in Japan, but it's just interesting to think.
Agreed.
Why the changes? Like you said earlier, why did they do them, and did it make it better? Did they sell better because of it, or did it not really do anything?
I agree.
So that's it for me. What about yourself?
I liked that I learned about a Simpsons video game I had never heard of. Most of these games I had, right? Bart versus the Space Mutants and Juggernauts and Radioactive Man, they were like in every gaming magazine on the face of the earth, right? Any of these games that were released for any of the platforms, because they were ported over to NES, SNES, Sega Genesis, all those. But I had never heard of that PC only game, The House of Weirdness. Um, and it was really interesting finding a game I had never heard of like that and getting to sit down and watch it. And it was a good game. I'm really surprised it never ended up anywhere else. It was a Konami game. So there's a, like, it was just surprising. It was just surprising that it never went anywhere, did anything, and so on and so forth. Now, with that being said, the playthrough's like 17 minutes. It's not a big investment. I think the speed record I found a speed record for in 8 minutes. It's not a long game, which may be the reason why, but it's a good game nonetheless, and I would suggest people check it out. So that was the fun part for me. So,
Right
all
on.
right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of here and into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I will just take a quick moment to say thank you so much to all of our listeners. It means the world to us to have you along as we learn about some of our interesting video game topics. So thank you, and we hope you continue to listen.
Yes, indeedy. Well, that wraps up our nostalgic visit to Springfield, where the Simpsons Arcade Game and Bart versus the Spice Mutants kicked off decades of interactive fun in in Springfield itself. From arcades to consoles, the Simpson family has brought us their humor and charm to countless gaming experiences. So whether you're brawling in an arcade or exploring a digital Springfield, I want you to always remember the mischief and magic of the Simpsons of gaming. Next week, though, we're leaving behind the brawls of Springfield and grabbing our cameras for a tranquil yet thrilling journey with Pokemon Snap, Rob.
Ooh, snappy snap snap.
Released in 1999 for the Nintendo 64, this unique adventure turned Pokemon trainers into photographers, challenging players to capture stunning shots of their favorite creatures in the wild. So join us as we explore the innovation, charm, and magic of turning Gotta Catch 'em All into Gotta Snap 'em All on next week's picture perfect trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Scoot up, up, ba da da, ba ba doo 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 up.